Okay, friends, I'm going to walk you a bit through the basic principles of medical ethics. This is an introduction to underscore basically an approach and a framework for us throughout the semester as we explore different case studies. So, first, what is meant by ethics? It's about making choices, usually hard ones, but not everything is an ethical issue. It's an ethical issue when we encounter conflicting values, beliefs, goals, or responsibilities, when we are concerned that persons or their rights are not being respected. We are concerned about fairness and justice, and we are unsure what we should do or why we should do it, at least morally speaking. There are levels of different moral responses. So there's the expressive level, which is unanalyzed. Those are expressions or feelings that by themselves don't provide reasons or justifications. There's the pre-reflective level, which is where you put in a justification via law or religious tenet or social value or your own code of ethics. And these are accepted uncritically. These are your value systems, basically. And then there is the reflective level, which is when one is reasoning an ethical argument. It's a defense based on principles, rules, virtues, values to which we consciously subscribe to. And that's the justification, right? So these different levels of moral response, expressive, pre-reflective, reflective, to a certain extent, map the process by which we come to ethical decisions, right? So when I'm talking about ethical principles, what I am not doing, right, is talking about feelings, religion, following the law, following culturally accepted norms. Ethics is not even science, right? The relationship between moral and other regulative norms is what underscores ethical values, right? So there's a moral norm, which is a specific individual system of personal values with validity of genesis, development, and adoption. Other regulative norms, so these are close to moral, of primitive society, of customs, of religion, of law. So that relation between moral and other regulative norm is really critical because we all have our own moral compass. Now, ethics are moral principles. It is giving you a sense of what is good and bad, what is right and wrong, and it's based on a particular value system. And I would say, if I'm thinking of a value system, is one of human rights, because ethical principles in medicine really emerge as a value that is really structuring all the relationships within medical practice after World War II, right? With the emergence of this concept of human rights. And a lot of this is due because of the Nazi experiments, right? And how eugenics basically was the pseudoscience by which they justified violating human rights. So experimenting without a subject's consent or doing harm, right? Because doing no harm is basically the par excellence value, and we hear it in the Hippocratic Oath. So ethical norms are not universal. It depends on the subculture of the society. So think about it like this. It matters the culture, the context, and the contingency, right? Because again, these ethical principles or these ethical norms change based on the society in which it is applied. So ethics refers to standards of behavior that tell us how human beings ought to act in the many situations in which they find themselves. So even with friends, parents, children, citizens, business people. But historically, medical ethics may be traced to guidelines on the duty of physicians, such as the Hippocratic Oath, which you were to read. A physician must recognize responsibility to patients first and foremost, as well as to society, to other health professionals, professionals and to self. These are not laws but standards of conduct which define the essentials of honorable behavior for the physician. So medical ethics is a field of applied ethics, the study of moral values and judgments as they apply to medicine. This is why in your writing I always impress the necessity to have a call to action, right? Because we learn who we are not in theory but in practice. So you have to think about how can these values or these principles be applied in clinical settings or even in non-clinical setting. As you know, some of my work was in rapid HIV testing in non-clinical settings, but that does not mean I had to ignore medical ethics. On the contrary, they became critical in terms of building trust with the community I was working with, because they knew that they were boundaries, right? They were protections that were given to them as subjects because of medical ethics. So as a scholarly discipline, medical ethics encompasses its practical application in clinical settings as well as work in history, philosophy, theology, sociology, and my favorite discipline, anthropology. So if we go into the history of medical ethics, I mean, we could go back as 1803 with the basis for the first American Medical Association Code of Medical Ethics, which is called Percival's Code. Then you get Beaumont's Code in the United States, and that is in 1833, which basically created particular protections for experimental treatments, voluntary informed consent. But think about the time, 1833. Those protections were granted to a particular type of group, right? So if you were basically a person of color, you were more vulnerable at that time because those protections were not necessarily thought of as important for these particular vulnerable groups, right? So we see, as with the evolution of medical ethics, that it is really important for us to think about also the group that it is helping to protect, right? So then you have Walter Reed in 1898, which introduces written consent contracts. So Walter Reed, that's the name also of the veteran hospital in Washington, D.C. And so he was really important in terms of allowing healthy human subjects in medical experiments to make choices, to practice autonomy, to know and get the information necessary to make decisions about whether or not they want to consent to being healthy human subjects for medical experiments. The Berlin Code or Prussian Road in 1900, so no medical experiments when subject not competent to give informed consent. So if they're not fully in their faculty, so think of people who need a proxy or a legal guardian to make decisions for them. In the most obvious case, children, if they are not legally emancipated, because children in the United States, for example, can be automatically emancipated. For example, if they give birth to a child and it's a teenager, right? So, you know, in the United States, you're emancipated at the age of 18. And so if you have a child at 14 in the United States, you, upon giving birth of that child, you become a legal adult, right? So in those cases, a legal adult does not need to ask for consent. But think about then also people who may have their faculties compromised or have cognitive challenges that don't allow them to fully understand information, so therefore they're unable to give consent. The Reich Circular in 1932, which was concerned with consent and well-being of the subjects. So these are the codes of medical and human experimentation ethics, which were critical to move us where we are today. So why study medical ethics? So think about it in terms of, it's not something necessarily that you learn in the context of your family, which I think the word is kind of misleading, because we're like, okay, your ethics are something that is learned by observing and by also learning a particular curriculum. But that's not true. Medical ethics is always and has been an essential component of medical practice. Some ethical principles are basic to the physician-patient relationship, but application in specific situations is often problematic due to disagreement about what is the right way to do things. And I mean, this is the subject of a lot of, think about it, television shows, right? When they're having those crazy moments where the physician has to make a life-saving decision. I think there was a show recently actually called Transplant, and it's on Fox, I believe. And anyway, it looks at those type of dilemmas, and obviously it's very dramatic. And think of every show that is built around basically the hospital setting. It's because people have to make these decisions that sometimes are immediate. They don't have the luxury of time to ponder if this is the right way or not, so that adds to a lot of drama. But really, study of ethics prepares medical students to recognize these difficult situations and to deal with them in a rational and principled manner. So as dramatized and mystifying as these representations on television about what happens in the hospital, medical ethics is constantly trying to prepare doctors to undertake these very unexpected situations and how to move forward in the best way that protects not only subjects but also limits liability and risk, right? Because there's malpractice suits. So bioethics kind of prepares a doctor to think about it. It's a branch of applied ethics that studies the philosophical, social, and legal issues arising in medicine and the life sciences. And I underscore legal issues because, again, if we're talking about the reduction of risk, we're also talking about liability. It is chiefly concerned with human life and well-being, though it sometimes also treats ethical questions relating to non-human biological environment. So think about experiments on animals, right? Sentient beings, or think about also natural disasters and the preparedness and management of that. So questions answered by bioethics, deciding what we should do, so what decisions are morally right or acceptable, explaining why we should do it, so how do we justify a decision in moral terms, and describing how we should do it, so the method or manner of our response when we act on the decisions. Now, there are 4 basic principles of medical ethics, and it's autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. I'll repeat that: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. For us in this course, I'm really guided by the principle of justice, and it's kind of like the golden rule, right? When I used to work at the UN, there was a Norman Rockwell mosaic, and we used to talk about it when we have visitors because it had the golden rule, which is basically a principle that appears in all different, texts that from the Upanishads to the Christian Bible to the Judeo scriptures. So it shows basically in the Quran, this idea, right, that treat others as you would like to be treated yourself, and so if you apply that, all these other things are respected. So obviously, if you treat others as you would like to be treated, you're not gonna do harm to them, right? So if we think about justice as a guiding fundamental principle, then we're valuing and respecting autonomy. We're not gonna do harm. We're gonna think in the best interest of the individual, or in cases the community in which that individual lives. So what is the concept of autonomy? So a patient has freedom of thought, intention, and action when making decisions regarding healthcare procedures. For a patient to make a fully informed decision, he or she must understand all risks and benefits of the procedure and the likelihood of success, right? So in order for them to be able to make decisions, they need full information, right? And always respect the autonomy of the patient. Then the particular patient is free to choose. So basically, if they're treated like a rational being, then you also know that they're going to make the best interest based on what they know of their situation as well, right? Think about it in terms of cancer patients who choose not to continue with chemotherapy, right? Or think about non-compliant patients, for example, as myself, who does not take the prescribed interferon from the management of multiple sclerosis. That is my choice, right? Because I have autonomy. So such respect is not simply a matter of attitude, but a way of acting so as to recognize and even promote the autonomous actions of the patient. The autonomous person may freely choose loyalties or systems of religious belief that may adversely affect them. So think about a patient who chooses not to have a blood transfusion because they believe that this is against their convictions, their religious convictions. A doctor cannot impose that on them if they are an autonomous person, right? I think about Bob Marley, who did not want to amputate where the cancer was starting on his, I believe, leg, right? And so he made that decision because as an autonomous patient, even though perhaps it could have extended his life, it went against who he was and his beliefs. So even our ethical principles have to respect that, right? Because as an autonomous individual, it is up to him to make that choice. And they take into account what they believe is necessary in order to make that choice. So whether it is, deciding to end a course of treatment or to pursue an alternative, again, that individual is making that decision based on their needs. So for me, deciding not to continue taking the medication for multiple sclerosis was because it made me feel horrible. I had no quality of life. I could not hug. I could not, do the things that made me feel human. So when I decided to pursue another treatment course that did not necessarily involve pharma, for the doctors, as much as they tried to dissuade me from doing that, it was my choice. And so there is a basic understanding in the dynamic between doctor and patient that the doctor cannot impose their belief in what could be best for the patient. So the patient must be informed clearly the consequences of his action that may affect him adversely, as I said. So desiring to benefit the patient, the physician may strongly want to intervene, believing it to be a clear medical benefit. The physician has a duty to respect the autonomous choice of the patient, as well as the duty to avoid harm and to provide a medical benefit. But the physician should give greater priority to the respect for patient autonomy than to the other duties. However, at times, this can be difficult because it can conflict with the paternalistic attitude of many healthcare professionals. Because if you're going to a doctor's office, you are looking for their expert opinion on what to do concerning your health, right? In the case of a child, the principle of avoiding the harm of death and the principle of providing a medical benefit that can restore the child to health and life will be given precedence over the autonomy of the child's parents as surrogate decision makers. So there have been cases in which doctors have to make a decision that has a medical benefit that may or may not be in agreement with the parents' beliefs. So whether, let's say, it's an issue of a blood transfusion, the parents are Jehovah's Witness, right? Or there was a case of evangelical parents who their child was having a high fever, and was so high the child began to convulse. Instead of taking the child to the hospital, the parents took the child to a prayer service at a church and continued to pray for the child's healing. The child eventually goes into a coma and passes away. At that point, the parents take the child to the hospital. Now, the child ends up dying from dehydration, right? So a very preventable death. but they chose to take the child to the church instead of the hospital, and so those parents were tried, right? There was legal consequences, criminal consequences for that, because the parents did not act in the best interest of the child's health as surrogate decision makers. So there are consequences to that. So that's why at times doctors may make a decision that goes against the parents' personal decisions, because as surrogate decision makers they're not actually avoiding the harm of death, right? And that is a case example that I guess reflects that. Beneficence: the practitioner must act in the best interest of the patient, right? So to the benefit of the procedure, be provided with the intent of doing good to the patient. So think about making this decision of an amputation, right? Usually when that happens, it's because it's in the best interest of the patient, even though the procedure in itself is going to have long lasting consequences in how that individual engages with the world or moves around through it, right? So beneficence, it's really putting into focus how you make these decisions in a way where the utmost benefit goes back to the patient's community, family. This needs a healthcare provider to develop and maintain skills and knowledge by continually updating their training, right? So in order to make the best decision that benefits the patient, you have to have the most up-to-date information, because if not, basically you're not necessarily acting or being fully capable to act in the best interest of the patient. So consider individual circumstances of all patients. So in order to do that, the doctor has to have a wide world view, right? Because if you are living basically in a bubble as a health practitioner, you cannot serve a diverse set of patients, because you have no idea what could make them sick, the social determinants of health, because social determinants are everything but the genes, right? So it's the water you drink, it's the air that you breathe, all these things. But if you don't have a sense of the social world of your patient, there's going to be a barrier to your ability to serve and improve the health of that patient. So non-maleficence is above all do no harm. So make sure that the procedure does not harm the patient or others in society. When interventions undertaken by physicians create a positive outcome while also potentially doing harm, it is known as the double effect. So for an example, the use of morphine in the dying patient, it eases pain and suffering while also hastening the demise through suppression of the respiratory drive, right? So physicians are obligated not to prescribe medications they know to be harmful, and this has been at the center of all the litigation around opioids, right? Or fentanyl. Prince was basically killed because of fentanyl. I mean, it was, or think about like the painkillers that were prescribed to a lot of artists that we saw that have succumbed. So even Heath Ledger, right? That concoction of prescriptions that interacted in adverse ways with each other. What doctor is going to do that? And there's a lot out there right now in terms of lawsuits of particular pharmaceuticals or particular legal prosecution against doctors who have abused basically their ability to prescribe, right? And so for example, opioids, painkillers, it takes 5 days for your body to become dependent on it. So how do you then prescribe a young person, or let's say who has an injury, and then they're given these opioids to manage the pain associated with that injury, but they don't inform them that if it's used for prolonged periods of time, it could cause dependency, and then a person could then develop substance abuse disorder. And so we've seen this happen over and over again. So it's important to think about basically the obligation not only of physicians but even pharmacists, right? Some interpret this value to exclude the practice of euthanasia. Violation or non-maleficence is the subject of many medical malpractice litigations. So what is medical malpractice? Is an act or omission by a healthcare provider that deviates from accepted standards of practice in the medical community, which causes injury to the patient. Now, justice, right? This principle again centers a lot of this course. It's the distribution of health resources and the decision of who gets what treatment in a fair and equal way. So the burdens and benefits of new or experimental treatments must be distributed equally among all groups in society. So think about right now the conversations that are taking place around the distribution of a vaccine, if it is to happen in the near future, right? So who gets access to it? Is it safe, right? All this is being brought to the surface because people are concerned because they lack particular trust at the moment in our public health institutions because of market forces. So it was interesting that today on September 8th there was a commitment of 9 pharmaceutical companies that are engaging in vaccine trials to not politicize the decisions surrounding the vaccine. So basically they agreed to ethically not only advance the trials but to not rush it, so then they could continue building trust. And so it's an interesting signing that these companies did. It's one in terms of public trust, a move to also respond to the market, or rather the market respond to what's happening, where there is a sense that this is becoming politicized. So if we're going to be practicing justice, then you can't be subject to that, right? You can't advance something if, let's say, there are unintended consequences that can be prevented by going through the process of scientific trials, right? You want empirical evidence. You want to be able to have empirical data to support that this is the best option, and so then make the decisions about who gets access to it. Now, the 4 main areas that healthcare providers must consider when evaluating justice are the following things. Number 1, fair distribution of scarce resources, right? You want to make sure that there is equity and that everyone's going to be able to access health. And this becomes a problem when you're dealing with an industry of health, right? Where profit is the bottom line. That then sometimes is incompatible with some ethical principles. For example, number 2, competing needs. So who needs these vaccines, for example, more? So essential workers, the most vulnerable of the community, right? So you start thinking about basically the needs of the community, and you do an impact study, right? Number 3, rights and obligations. And number 4, potential conflicts with established legislation. So you want to make sure that what you are offering is not against the law, right? But sometimes the law can in itself be counterintuitive to certain ethical principles. I think about a legislation in I believe it's Mississippi, where a doctor, basically an OBGYN, can lie about the status of the fetus as a means to dissuade the mother from terminating the pregnancy. And that is completely antithetical to the principle of justice and all the other 3, right? Non-beneficence, beneficence, and autonomy, but because of particular values that are prevailing in the community where they're anti-choice, then this is permitted under the law. So you can see the tensions that get teased out when real life circumstances happen, and then you're trying to apply principles, but then you have legislations that kind of work against them. So what are some of the questions for you thinking about the making of ethical decisions, the process, right? So you need an awareness. Is there a moral issue here, right? What is its nature? How important is it? What are the facts, right? What are the issues? What rules of values apply here? To whom and what do I owe a duty? How should they be applied? Who needs to decide and act? Who ought to? To what am I obligated because of role and position? What are the consequences? What are the options? So that's the process of making ethical decisions. It's not something that is impulsive or that it's easily surmisable, right? You have to kind of unpack a bit the issue at hand. How do individuals decide what is ethical? There are two different ways of approaching this. So number one, non-rational. So not irrational, just non-rational, right? And then there's number two, rational. So duties to whom or what? So individuals, you have to think about patients, families, guardians, colleagues, co-workers, and self. To groups, so think of profession, society, or the weak, the vulnerable. To ideas, so think about the law. To truth, to justice, to individual value. And so the duties of a health practitioner, it's not just to the individual patient, right? It's the patient in context, the community that patient is from, the profession. So it becomes very loaded. Now, the framework for ethical decision making in practice is number one, determine whether the issue at hand is an ethical one to start with, right? Number two, consult authoritative sources to see how physicians generally deal with such issues. So you look at precedents. Number three, consider alternative solutions, right? You always have a plan B, plan C, contingency plans. Number four, discuss your proposed solution with those whom it will affect, the stakeholders, right? You can't make individual decisions because these problems are not in a vacuum and they impact not only the individual, but the individual in the context of its family, community, again, and so on. So make your decision and act on it. That's number five. And number six, evaluate your decision and be prepared to act differently in the future. So you have to adapt to the fullest sense of the word in the practice of medical ethics. With this lecture, I am also going to connect to a lecture on the institution of public health, which is critical for us to kind of think about the practice of ethical principles in our current state. Thank you.